Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Brazen Serpent. We're going to be continuing our study in First Corinthians chapter 7. We had talked about previously just how that sexual immorality reveals spiritual immaturity in the faith. Okay, if we are behaving in sexually immoral ways, we reveal we are not as wise as we suppose, and we are not as spiritual as we suppose. Likewise, if we do not mourn over sin, if sin does not grieve us, and instead we ignore it in our churches, this is also a potential sign of spiritual immaturity. Spiritually mature people will confront sin properly. And from that also, Paul discusses how the body does not belong to us alone, but to Christ. So we should honor Christ with our bodies in everything we do. From this point, Paul now speaks to us about marriage. The Church of Corinth clearly had some issues in how they perceived sexual intimacy and marriage. Some seemed to suppose sex was made for pleasure, and pleasure is for the body, while disregarding the body belongs to Christ. So, not all sex is honoring to God if it is enjoyed outside the marriage covenant. But that being said, let's start in verse 1. It says, "Now concerning the things that you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband." So there are a few positions on these two verses that start us off. Some believe that Paul is saying as a statement, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, whereas some believe Paul is responding to a statement, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. I would lean more in the direction that Paul is quoting the Church of Corinth, but that he is also in slight agreement. Okay, so I believe the verses afterwards are Paul's elaboration on the issue. Okay, he's giving more detail, more ways to look at this besides just that one statement. So truly, especially in the context of Corinth, sexual immorality was common. Okay, and so it would be easy to see that some saints there were concluding it might be better just to remain in abstinence from marriage and sex. Seeing as adultery and fornication were a regular way of life historically in Corinth, it's reasonable why some might think this way. Now, when Paul says touch, he does not mean merely to touch a woman. Paul is not forbidding physical contact with the opposite gender in all circumstances. If that were the case, if a woman fell over, you wouldn't be able to grab her hand and pull her back up. Okay, so that's not what he's saying here. The Greek word here for touch is hapto, and at times it is translated to light, like lighting a candle, or even to kindle. So the Greek word itself does not narrowly mean touching someone with your hand in most circumstances. There are some circumstances the word is used merely to imply physical touch, but that is unlikely in this case. Genesis 20, verse 6, God says to Abimelech concerning Abraham's wife, I suffered thee not to touch her. And again, in Proverbs 6:29, speaking of another man's wife, it says, He that goeth in to his neighbor's wife, whosoever toucheth her, shall not be innocent. And so now, in Proverbs, it is common for the sayings um, in that book to be synonymous, parallel structures. Okay, so the phrase goeth into and toucheth are seen in synonymous parallel ways. Okay, touching is what we might call a Hebrew idiom for sex. Okay, so when Paul says touch, it's highly likely he's referring to sex here, not just mere physical contact. Going back to Jesus' ministry, we will actually find that Jesus spoke to them, his disciples, essentially stating it was sinful and wrong to get divorced, and obviously, unless she cheated on him or he cheated on her. It is wrong to marry someone who is divorced, and Jesus plainly states that. Because of this, the disciples responded, If the case of the man be so with his wife, it's not good to marry. Jesus doesn't deny their statement and simply states, All men cannot receive this saying, save they to whom it is given. For there are some eunuchs which were so born from their mother's womb, and there are some eunuchs which were made eunuchs of men, and there be eunuchs which have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. He that is able to receive it, let him receive it. And so, uh, essentially, Jesus doesn't deny that being single is in some ways more profitable and better for the kingdom. In some ways, Even Paul admits later in the letter, I wish that all men were even as I myself am. But every man has his proper gift from the Lord, one after this kind and another after that. Therefore I say to the unmarried and widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. But if they cannot exercise self control, let them marry, for it is better to marry than to burn. And on a side note, when you're reading the letter of Timothy, you'll notice that Paul speaks of the younger widows. Actually, let me go ahead and just turn there briefly. Okay. So he speaks of the younger widows, um, but refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow undisciplined against Christ, they will marry, having condemnation because they cast off their first faith. So, um, now that being said, he's essentially describing the reality that a lot of younger widows, a lot of younger women, if they are made widows, instead of choosing to abide in Christ, rely on Him, and exercise a level of self control, um, a lot of the times they end up getting married anyway because their passions are just so overwhelming. So, and in a lot of circumstances, they get married to people they probably even shouldn't. So that's another thing. Um, he's really, it's just when he says if they cannot exercise self-control, most people can't exercise self-control, and especially younger people, okay? Especially a young man and a young woman. They're rarely ever going to be able to exercise self-control. So even when he's speaking, he says, who is he speaking to, right? Um, I say to the unmarried and widows. So he's talking to the widows. In what circumstance is it probably going to be more likely that a widow will actually remain unmarried? It's probably going to be with the older widow, the older women, because the older women tend to just naturally not be as passionate for sexual intimacy. Okay, that's a pretty well known fact. But regardless, okay, he says if you can't exercise self control, just get married. Okay, and so he even says back at that passage that I quoted, he says to the younger widows, just let them get married, bear children, or to the younger women, let them get married, bear children, that no occasion for the devil can come upon them. Essentially, just get married so that you can avoid condemnation and avoid any other bad circumstances. So, both Jesus and Paul admit it's better to be single. Singleness is seen as a gift. Okay, so Paul literally said that, right? People are gifted differently. Individuals who can go through life without burning in lust and can exercise a miraculous amount of self control find they don't need to get married, and so they live life completely free from being bound to a woman. Okay, they can solely focus on the ministry in the kingdom of God. And so Paul says later, he who is unmarried cares for the things that belong to the Lord, how he may please the Lord. Okay? In that sense, in many ways, marriage can be something or be seen as something that will hold you back from doing certain things for the Lord. And because of that, singleness is seen as a gift, not a curse. Jesus clarifies, some are born in such a way they will never get married because of it. Okay? And that's probably a very general statement. It could involve a lot of things. Some men are made eunuchs because they were castrated. Okay, they don't have sexual organs. Okay, they don't have the ability to even do that in the first place. So some men are eunuchs merely because they are so heavily focused on the gospel, they pretty much have no desire to be married. Um, on a similar note, later in the letter, some were examining Paul and judging him. He says, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? And later, do we not have the right to take along a sister, a wife, as other apostles and brothers of the Lord? And Cephas, that's Peter. Or do only Barnabas and I have no right to refrain from working? So some men in Corinth were judging Paul as less spiritual, but really Paul had displayed a seriously miraculous level of spirituality in the fact that he was wholly dedicated to the service of Christ. Could Paul had become lustful and settled down? Well, in some ways he could have, right? I mean, I imagine he could have. Could Paul have taken a break from working in the gospel ministry? Truly, Paul could have, but he didn't. And all this simply served to show the devotion he had to Christ and the love he had for the church and the lost. It is admirable that he was so devoted, he didn't even desire to get married. He's like, I don't have time for that. that's that's kind of where Paul was at this point. And that's admirable. It is. There's no shame in that. There isn't. But returning back to the primary passage, Paul tells them, despite the fact it may be good to be single and to never be sexually involved with women, to avoid fornication, let every man have his own wife, and let every woman have her own husband. While Jesus and Paul both taught it is good to be single, most men and women are not gifted by God to live a life of celibacy. Most men have strong passions just as women do. Women and men both generally have strong passions. So then it's good for us who have those passions, just get married, okay? It's good to get married. When the Catholic Church encouraged abstinence and celibacy, it was to an unhealthy degree, especially in the past. Because of this, many monks and nuns were caught in the midst of sexual immorality because they had taken an oath to remain virgins for life. In reality, most of them had passions that were far too strong, and so it was really unwise for them to have taken that oath, okay? For them to have remained unmarried. There are some horror stories of like all the nuns getting pregnant, and all kinds of stuff. And that's because they were not being realistic, okay? And Paul is trying to give us some wisdom here. Don't be unrealistic. If you have passions, it's better for you to get married, okay? Um, it's more profitable at that point to get married because your passions can lead you into sinful behavior if you let them. Sex is designed by God to be enjoyed and indulged in marriage. Proverbs 5, verse 15. Drink waters out of thine own cistern, and running waters out of thine own well. Let thy fountains be dispersed abroad, and rivers of waters in the streets. Let them be only thine own, and not strangers with thee. Let thy fountain be blessed, and rejoice with the wife of thy youth. And so sexual intimacy is not intended to be shared. It's not intended to be indulged anywhere else but in the context of a man and a woman who are married. Some men are the exception, okay? And some women are the exception when it comes to singleness and celibacy, right? They have that gift. But when it's made into a cultural norm, or when celibacy is overly encouraged in churches, it will inevitably lead to sexual immorality. So then it's better to be realistic and to encourage godly marriages. Um, I'd say this even in regard to some colleges, even the one I came from. I think there were times when, especially when people initially got there, it was so heavily encouraged to remain single, not to get invested or anything like that. But some of the people coming to the colleges clearly had very strong passions. Um, they were looked down upon for choosing to get married rather than remaining single and continuing on. Um, you've got to really stop and think about that for a second. Okay, if two individuals are so passionate, they're likely going to give in to sexual immorality if they don't marry. It is better for them to marry, even if that means they're not going to continue at the college. Even if that means they don't continue in your program you originally sought out for them. Okay, so that's an issue that some of the Catholic monks and nuns had. They were encouraged to continue in the programs, the monasteries, and various other functions they had there, to continue on the work of the kingdom. So much so, they were told, "Hey, remain single. Don't get married right now. Don't do it." In fact, they were told, "Don't get married ever." Right? And regardless, I would say the only circumstance it's really good to tell people to remain unmarried to avoid getting married is if they don't potentially if they don't know the person too well, right? Though you'll never know them completely. A lot of things end up being exposed in marriage that you find out later. So you can't you can't know everything. So don't expect people to know everything about the person. Also, um, maybe um, just if they don't know if they're the one for them, right? I mean, there's things like that. Um, or, if the person is living in a completely just wicked lifestyle, then I mean, as a pastor, if I was a pastor, I'd advise that person, don't get together with that person. They're living in a completely immoral lifestyle. It's going to lead you in a tragically bad direction. Now, here's the thing, okay? You have one man, he feels called to the ministry. You have one woman, she just feels called to be a mother. I've known some people say to those individuals, because she's not as passionate about the ministry to do it as much as you are, don't get married. I don't believe that. I think that's ridiculous. To be quite frank, God doesn't, for one, he doesn't command us to go to a college or a seminary. Two, he doesn't command that the wife be just as invested in the calling of her husband. Um, that's the husband's calling, not the wife's. Okay. You get married particularly for what Paul is dealing with here, to avoid sexual immorality. That's one of the primary reasons you get married. Now, um, when it comes down to it, if the woman is not really as interested in the calling of her husband, it's better for her to learn to submit and just be willing to go whatever direction he's going, you know? That's what biblical submission to your husband as the head of the home looks like. So it's not when your wife is not feeling like she's called to do exactly what you feel called to do, that in of itself is not an absolute indication that you shouldn't get married. So just there's a lot of voices out there, a lot of people who are going to push you to not get married, to avoid marriage, and I dealt with that personally. Um, some people treated marriage as evil. Some were always telling us like it's going to end. I mean, I was basically told that my marriage was going to end in me cheating on my wife just because we had passions, and because, we might have, you know, struggled with those passions, to, just wait. Okay. That being said, um, I'm trying to really just not talk in too much detail, but just because two people struggle with passions as well is not an indication they shouldn't get married. Sometimes that is the indication. That is the indication, right? Um, Let me turn back to the passage here. I didn't write all of this down, and I'm trying better to actually not just read off of a script, because sometimes you just need to keep it short. But let me turn back here and read the specific verse. Okay. If any man thinks that he is behaving improperly toward his virgin, if she is past the flower of her age, and his needs require it, let him do what he will. He is not sin. Let them marry. Okay. Nevertheless, he who stands steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but having power over his own will, and is so decreed in his heart that he will keep his virgin, does well. Um, so then he who gives her in marriage does well, but he who does not give her in marriage does better. Okay. So yes, singleness in some circumstances can be seen as better, but getting married when two people are passionately desiring each other is also good. It's good because if it leads you to have um, sexual intimacy before marriage, or it stirs up passions that later are consumed upon somebody else, and it just leads to a cycle of having sex with a bunch of other people, then you have a bigger issue. Okay. So don't discourage people from getting married just because they're struggling with passions. Okay, that is exactly the reason you get married. That is that is the reason Paul says here to get married. Okay, because we as human beings, generally speaking, are going to lack self-control. You're, we lack self-control. It is no wonder that a pastor who's gone from his wife for several months might commit adultery because we lack self-control. So it probably wasn't wise in the first place to leave your wife for several months. These things are just, these are no-brainers, okay? And Paul is trying to say, have some common sense with this stuff, okay? Just marriage is for abstaining from fornication and adultery. Enjoy it, be wise with it, but do not condemn people who get married. Okay, don't condemn the people who are uniting in a biblical marriage to avoid fornication. I see that happen a lot. A lot of young people get married. All the older people, oh, you should have waited till you were 30. Oh, you should have waited till you were 40. And to be quite frank, that's nonsense. That's not what Paul says. Paul says if you guys can't contain, let them marry. Okay? Because I've heard this too. Um, oh, you guys don't have the money to get this dream home or whatever, this dream idea of what it looks like to live in stability. Um, I'm thankful. I'm very thankful for my in-laws. They've helped us out a lot. Okay, but even if that weren't the case, if I was back where I was, we would have been very, very poor. We would have, and they've helped us out. But I was poor to begin with, and I knew that being poor in of itself is not a reason to abstain from getting married. Now, is it better for the man to at least have some ability to provide for his wife? Absolutely. If he can't take care of her, yes. All right, that's obvious. But all right, some people have it in their head, well, they're going to have to rent an apartment. They're going to have to do something that is not ideal. That alone is not a reason to abstain from getting married. Okay? If they're struggling, let them get married. Do not condemn them. They're doing it because they were struggling in their passions towards each other. And yes, they loved each other. So don't give them a hard time about it. That's nonsense. Okay. I dealt with that. People gave us a hard time about it. We shouldn't give people a hard time. Okay. Um, but continuing on in verse 3, sorry, he says, let the husband render due benevolence to the wife, and likewise also the wife to the husband. The wife does not have authority over his own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband also does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another unless it is with consent for a time, that ye may give yourselves to fasting and prayer, and come together again, that Satan will not tempt you for your lack of self control. Okay, so again, um, if you are going to be married, your body doesn't belong to yourself, even as we stated before, our bodies belong to Christ. So it's not unreasonable to say that your body belongs to your wife and vice versa. You guys owe it to your wife and you owe it to your husband. If one of them is desiring your body, you give your body to them because you don't belong to yourself and you should desire to please them. Okay, you should desire to satisfy those sexual needs. Okay, they are legitimate needs. We all lack self control. If you abstain and you force them to not have intimacy with you because you're mad at them constantly, it's going to lead to adultery, or at least like adultery in the body, or at least adultery in the heart. Okay, one of those two things. So put away your anger, put away your silly fighting, and just, quite frank, have sex. Okay, forgive me for being so blunt. Have sex. Stop. Okay. Um, going beyond that, no matter how experienced you are in your walk with the Lord, okay, really, you should make it an effort to be intimate with your spouse. It doesn't matter what age you are, any of that. Just try, try your best. Pray. Okay. Um, we really have a big dilemma in our country. Either the wife doesn't feel like it, the husband doesn't feel like it, so they only come together when they both feel like it, and that tends to make intimacy a rare occasion. You can't have a stable marriage built on that. Okay, so a general rule of thumb: if your spouse desires to be sexually intimate, don't tell him or her no. Okay, just don't. It's not a good idea. For their sake, just be willing to please them, even if you're not in the mood. Okay, try to get into the mood. Anyway, going on, verse 10. And I command to the married, yet not I, but the Lord, do not let the wife depart from her husband. But if she departs, let her remain unmarried or be reconciled to her husband. And do not let the husband divorce his wife. Okay. And so this, we get into some very um, uh, complicated things here. People tend to, in our country today, they support leaving your spouse and getting remarried. But that's not what Paul's saying here. He says he's teaching against divorce and he's teaching against getting remarried. Okay, he gives an exception clause. If she departs, then he states how she should go from there. Let her remain unmarried or be reconciled. There is a common trend going on today. If a woman's abused or if a man's abused, they are advised to get divorced. And under those circumstances, many are saying it's okay to get remarried. That's not what Scripture teaches. Scripture is very clear on this. If you marry someone who's divorced, you're committing adultery. And Jesus said that, okay? Because their body already was promised to someone else. Even though they've written a bill of divorcement, they've bound themselves with an oath previously and were sexually united. They became one flesh to the other person. So then, even if a woman or man are in an abusive marriage, Paul's teaching us to remain unmarried, okay, after divorce. If you cannot be reconciled to your husband, you are still to remain unmarried. And you might ask, how could Paul demand this of us? Okay, that seems so unfair to some people. It's because marriage is to be taken seriously. When you marry someone, you ought to seriously consider who you're marrying, right? And even in situations where a father might be the one deciding who their daughter marries, he ought to seriously consider the man he's giving his daughter to. Marriage can either be wonderful or the worst thing you could do. You can either be binding yourself into years of bliss, or you could be stuck with the worst person on earth. Okay. So when you get married, you should seriously consider who you're getting married to. Developing a holy sense of that in a child from their youth will hopefully prevent them from having passions too early into the relationship. So if you teach them to have some discernment, if you teach them to be careful, um, generally speaking, those passions are going to be restrained. Now, everybody's got a different idea of what a proper time frame for a relationship looks like before marriage. I'm not here to argue that. To be quite frank, I've known some really godly people who got married within a few months. I've known people who got married within a few years. Either way, everybody has to use their own discretion. Okay. Um, There are circumstances when men might cheat on their wife, so their wife leaves them, and the man sincerely repents and changes up his life. If she's already married another man, she's left no room for reconciliation to the husband of her youth. And again, if the man does the same thing, he leaves no room for reconciliation to the wife of his youth. As a general rule of thumb, most of us need to look at divorce as something we're not going to allow to happen to the best of our ability. Okay, you just don't do it. Even if you get divorced, you're not permitted by God to get remarried until that spouse has passed away. Okay. He continues in verse 12, but to the rest I, not the Lord, speak. If any brother has a wife who does not believe, and she is pleased to dwell with him, do not let him divorce her. And the woman who has a husband who does not believe, if he is pleased to dwell with her, do not let her leave him. For the unbelieving husband is sanctified by the wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified by the husband. Otherwise your children would be unclean, but now they are holy. If the unbeliever departs, let him depart. A brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For what do you know, O wife, whether you shall save your husband? Or how do you know, O man, whether you shall save your wife? So then, Paul's essentially telling us if we have an unbelieving spouse, it's better we remain with them and they to us. Finding out your spouse isn't saved is not a solid reason for divorce at all. If they choose to leave you, he doesn't say fight it. Okay, he doesn't say fight them to the death, right? If they're gonna do it, they're gonna do it. Let them be. Okay. And you can't really control that, especially because they don't even have the Spirit of Christ. They don't have His love in their heart. How are they going to be motivated to remain in union with you? Okay, that's kind of the idea there. But when he says a brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, he's not saying you can get remarried, okay? Otherwise, you're ignoring the whole previous passage, okay? And a lot of people would just claim they divorced their spouse because they didn't think they were born again. Okay, they could automatically say, "Well, they behaved in such a way that told me they weren't born again, so I just divorced them." No, that's ridiculous. Okay, so under every circumstance, God commands us to remain single after divorce. Okay, period. There's no exception unless that spouse has died. You are not truly free to remarry. For this reason, Paul later states, the wife is bound by the law as long as her husband lives. But if her husband dies, she is at liberty to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. So then, Paul is stating clearly, if your ex-husband is still alive, you don't have permission from God to be remarried. You promised to be with that person in sickness and in health. So if you're going to ignore that promise and remarry, you reveal your character and show your words essentially meant nothing. So, it's best we all take God's commandment seriously, remain single after divorce, and pray God will miraculously restore our marriages. Do not listen to the world. They're going to tell you to ditch your spouse, to throw the ring off your finger, because they don't understand what keeping a promise really looks like. But when you said, till death do us part, that was a legally binding promise in the eyes of God. If you break that promise, God's going to judge you. And if you are not binding yourself to that person with that oath in mind, that's not a biblical marriage in the eyes of God. A biblical marriage is when two individuals promise to be bound to that person until death, when they agree that they're going to remain with that person. Okay, that's the intention. When they have both of them have that intention, regardless of the culture, how marriages are performed, they are to remain together. Okay, and there's no exception with that. This is what the scriptures clearly teach. So I know this might offend people who have already been remarried. You're already remarried. Let's not dabble in that any further. There's nothing else that can be done. You can't go back. So, honor God with the marriage you've got now. Okay. But to the people who are divorced and single and their spouse is still alive, do not get remarried. All right. Paul states this pretty clearly. You're not permitted to. All right. You need to wait. Um, at least for reconciliation. You need to pray for it. Okay, that's what the heart of Christ would teach us to do.